Please welcome Cleveland Clinic's CEO and President, Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
Well, good afternoon and welcome. I hope you're not all hungover from a big Cavs victory. Well, we have a rare treat today, and I'm really thrilled to introduce David Gergen. He has had a towering career. He served 4 presidents, written for America's most distinguished publication, and interviewed major newsmakers of our time. He's a professor of public service and a best-selling author on leadership. Respected by all parties, he was recently called America's last reasonable man. David grew up in Durham on a dirt road in North Carolina. His father was chair of the mathematics department at Duke, and he played baseball as a teenager. But he grew too fast. A wild pitch broke a window, and he switched from sports to journalism. David went to college in the 1960s. During the summer, he worked for Governor Terry Stafford in North Carolina. He traveled the state, learning about the racial and civic rights issues. He recalls those summers as a formative experience. His White House years began after he departed the Navy in 1971. A friend in the Nixon administration invited him to interview for a low-level job. David went on to lead the White House speechwriting team. One of his final duties was to compose President Nixon's historic letter of resignation. That letter is now in the Smithsonian. David went on to work for President Gerald Ford and President Ronald Reagan. He coined Reagan's campaign keynote question, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago?" In 1993, President Bill Clinton shocked his fellow Democrats by hiring David as a counselor and special advisor. Outside the White House, David has had an influential career as a journalist. He is managing editor of the Journal of Public Opinion and editor and contributor of U.S. News and World Report. As a television reporter, he was part of teams that have won 2 Peabody Awards for election coverage. David has been married to his wife, Ann, since 1967. They have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. His son is an entrepreneur, and his daughter is a physician at the Boston Medical Center. David has received 27 honorary degrees over the years. Last month, he delivered a commencement address at Elon University in North Carolina. He spoke out against political extremism in the State House, saying, "Enough is enough." His remarks made national news. Many were critical, but one veteran observer described the speech in terms that capture the essence of David's life work. Words worth hearing, words worth heeding, and words worth sharing. Please watch this video.
Living moments in political history, standing alongside leaders of our country, whether in front of the camera as a journalist or behind the scenes as an advisor. David Gergen adheres to the highest principles in each of his roles, as a guide to presidents, an advocate for the public, and a voice of reason for both. Born in Durham, North Carolina, David Gergen seemed destined to be a journalist ever since he was editor of his high school newspaper. He continued reporting and became editor-in-chief at Yale, where he earned his bachelor's degree in American Studies. He went on to graduate with honors from Harvard Law School, and then served in the U.S. Navy, where he says his time as damage control officer on a repair ship was the best possible preparation for his coming years in the White House. In 1971, David Gergen joined President Nixon's staff as a speechwriter and went on to serve as Director of Communications for Presidents Ford and Reagan, and as a senior advisor to President Clinton.
One of the nation's most respected journalists and commentators, David Gergen. He is demonstrating a sense of patriotism that transcends partisanship.
After spending 3 decades in the White House, he described those experiences in Eyewitness to Power: The Essence of Leadership, Nixon to Clinton. The book quickly became a New York Times bestseller. When not advising the presidency, David Gergen is discussing it. Starting with the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour in 1984, he has been a regular commentator on public affairs for more than 30 years. He can currently be seen on CNN as a senior political analyst and has been a frequent guest on NPR and CBS's Face the Nation.
David manages to have a voice of reason. He's fair to both sides. I think his analysis is some of the clearest and most compelling.
Whether serving as a commentator or a political advisor, David Gergen is first and foremost an educator. As professor of public service and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School, he works closely with a rising generation of young leaders and serves on a number of nonprofit boards dedicated to enhancing the teaching and education of tomorrow's creative thinkers. From his decades in the Oval Office, the Situation Room, and at the anchor desk, David Gergen has remained at the center of American political thought. When he speaks, others listen. His vast experience in Washington sets him above the rest, extending his knowledge across the aisle with an educated voice of truth and reason.
Please welcome David Gergen. David, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We couldn't be more
Thank
pleased.
you for inviting me to Cleveland last night.
Great timing.
Coming back from 3-1.
David, you grew up in Durham, and Durham was not the Durham we know today. It was smaller and perhaps a little less sophisticated. Have you ever noticed the disproportionate number of American presidents who come from small towns?
Lamar Alexander, who's a senator from Tennessee, has written a study about this. He argues that small-town America and sort of the tree-leafed avenues and streets are the best place to raise leaders for the future, that your values are more traditional, you're more rooted, you've had a sense of caring. It does take a village to help raise a child, and you get that kind of response. I don't think that's always true, but it's certainly true that if you look back at most of our presidents who have been very successful, they have come from, byways of America. And whether you think of Washington had to earn his way in, he wasn't part of the aristocracy in Virginia. He got there the old-fashioned way. He married up. Married the richest widow in Virginia. But think of Lincoln's background or think of Jefferson's background. And that's certainly true. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was born with a silver spoon, but nonetheless, he grew up largely outside New York. And if you go up the Hudson and go to the FDR library, which I think is one of the best in the country because it's modest. It's like Harry Truman's. Or Harry Truman was born in small-town America, as you know. So, yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that. Lyndon Johnson was born in a small town. Reagan, for the modern presidents, Ford, came out of small. I was with Jerry Ford when he had his 90th birthday, and he'd said he'd had 3 great lessons in life that had served him all his life. It came from his mother. Said, work hard, tell the truth, and come to dinner on time. And I think those kind of values serve people very well. But I do want to say, first of all, let me just correct the record here and say one thing about this lovely film and your extraordinary introduction. The person who had a huge influence on my life and it plucked me out of the South China Sea when I was in the military to go back to Washington, came here from Cleveland. His name was Jonathan Rose. And his dad was here at Mudge Rose, Chappie Rose, who was a wonderful man. And another great friend, Al Rankin, is here today from that period. All of us went to Yale, and so there was the Cleveland Mafia that went to Yale. I'm not sure they all went to Williams, but they did go to Yale, and so I owe a lot to this fair city.
Well, thank you. You know, you talk about a couple of influences, your time in the military and your time as working for the civil rights in North Carolina. How did they influence you?
Well, I did grow up playing a lot of sports, but then I grew, as you said in your introduction, too fast and I lost control. And when I was trying out for the high school baseball team, and when I threw this wild pitch that went through a window, it was in a gym. It didn't just go through a window. It went through a window on the second floor.
It was a ball, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyway, I started working for the newspaper, and I became a newspaper writer for a couple of local newspapers we had in North Carolina. And that introduced me. I eventually went from sports over to news, and I was covering, the jail situation and crimes. I was covering, garbage men who were on strike, and it really introduced me to the African American community. When I was growing up in the South, I went to a segregated high school. African Americans lived on the other side of town, and we were told that that's basically the way they liked it. They liked separate schools. And it turned out it was a pack of lies. And you didn't realize that until you sort of got along a little bit in life. And then Terry Sanford became our governor, and he was like Jack Kennedy was to the country. He was a beacon of hope, and he had this loud, this clear, certain trumpet for public service. And a number of people in North Carolina, I was one of them, but there are a lot of people I most respect today, came to work for Terry. And I did that in college, and I wound up working on race relations for him. He set up a Good Neighbor Council for the state, and I became the chief assistant to the guy running it. And we went all over the state together. There was an older man who'd grown up a hard scrabble background, budget director, segregationist, and he changed his mind about what was right. And I spent all this time with him, 3 summers driving around, and I've had these, life-changing kind of experiences in Washington I'm very grateful for. But that time spent on civil rights was more meaningful to me than anything else I did, because it was for something, it was sort of an unalloyed good. It was something you really felt, if we get this right, it really makes a difference in the lives of a lot of people. And you don't always feel that in Washington. A lot of times you feel like this is not very attractive stuff we're working with here. And the military was, you went through the military, you were in Vietnam, you got a Bronze Star. I never did that, but I felt coming out of having gone to Yale and then going to Harvard Law and then going to the military was a really, really healthy thing for me, because I'd been with all these elite folks, and suddenly you were responsible. I was responsible for 50 sailors, many of whom hadn't finished high school. And they were mixed up about a lot of things. They were a little bit undisciplined, but they were good people. And it taught me a lot about the qualities that you can find in people who are not as wealthy or as rich or affluent or as educated as all of us in this room. And there's much good for those folks. They don't have to fit your perfect model. They don't have to be your best friend. But they can be people. You can see a lot of good in them, and if you can bring that out, if you can, one of the things we're going through in this campaign is people, candidates are playing to the fears, but if you can play to the aspirations and dreams, if you can draw those out, these are really highly productive people. And I feel, Toby, one of the real problems in the country now is that we don't grow up together the same way we did in a small town, where you did tend to mix with the high and the mighty, yep, and the others. And we just don't know. When we look at Trump voters, we don't even know who. Most of us don't know anybody who's going to vote for Donald Trump. At least I don't. I hear occasionally about it, but it's like when the whole issue of abortion came up, and I didn't know anybody who was pro-life. Everybody I knew was pro-choice. And you need to know people who are the evangelicals or the Tea Party and people like that, and not write them off as being other.
Well, the military certainly teaches that.
It does, and you do that in your clinic here. I mean, you deal with everybody,
yes, we
right?
do.
And you serve everybody,
right?
And we don't do that in much of what American life now.
Let me just ask you. You have had the extraordinary experience of serving 4 presidents, and you started out with Nixon.
Yep.
A complicated man.
He was, indeed.
And tell me, he must have had multiple sides to him.
Well, Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, as you know so well, argued, he was a contemporary of Freud's, and he argued that we all have bright sides and we have dark sides, and that the challenge in life is to sort of reconcile those two and to be able to and bring them into harmony. And Nixon had a very, very bright side. He was the best. He was not the smartest man I've seen in the presidency, but he was the best strategist. He was able to think and to go up on a mountaintop and look 20 years into the future and see how history was likely to unfold and try to bend it in America's national security interests. And he did the trip to China, and opening up China was one example of that. And if that had been all there was to Nixon, he would have been one of our more substantial figures, or more substantial presidents. I think he would have been in at least the second tier. But sadly, he had this very, very dark side. I mean, there were demons inside him he had not learned to control. And he had this view of politics that it's a law of the jungle. Either you eat or you're eaten, and you better get them before they get you. And so he had this conspiratorial view toward everybody who wasn't with him. And, it's been said that even paranoids have real enemies. But he had far more than you would ever imagine, and that brought him down. I mean, he was the architect of his own downfall. I remember he told David Frost after he left office, explaining what happened, Nixon said, "I gave my enemies a sword, and then they ran me through." And I think that was right. He did. He kicked it away. And it was a sad case because he represented so much, but it really taught me to underscore it. And David McCullough writes about this in his biography of Truman. And McCullough says, and I think it's right, that character is the most important asset of a leader, most important asset of a president. And Nixon simply did not have the character, the personal character that was ripe for the office. As much as he contributed, and I think you have to see him in 3 dimensions, but the character flaws brought him down.
Well, then you went from that to Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
And, there's 2 very different individuals.
Very different people. Very different people. Jerry Ford had the shortest time in the presidency of the 20th century, accidental president. And I think he, in some ways, blessed because he didn't have this driving ambition to be president. Nixon would have gone to his grave thinking he'd been a failure had he not been president. Jerry Ford would have been happy to go to his grave with the life he had before he got to the White House. Ronald Reagan would have been happy to do that. And it makes a real difference, I think, in leadership. You don't have this overweening ambition that Nixon and Johnson suffered from. But Jerry Ford I think looks better and better in the rearview mirror of history because he was a gentle, kind, and truthful man. You could trust him. In the Nixon years, you had to always watch who was going to come after you with a knife in the dark. And in the Ford years, it wasn't like that. It was a very civil group, and I think he was a healing influence. And Betty became, I think she helped to transform when she went public with her, her health issues. That was a courageous thing to do, and it's a much beloved figure in many ways.
Speak a little bit about your thoughts about pardoning Nixon.
Oh. Well, I'm biased, but I think again, in hindsight, it was very striking to me that the Kennedy Library in Boston gives an annual award for courage, for political courage, and while he was still, shortly before he died, they gave an award to Jerry Ford for pardoning Richard Nixon. That was to me a real, okay. I thought Ford did the right thing because I can't tell you how much, Toby, the lingering forces of Watergate were dominating everything he did. Almost every decision got crowded out. But what are you going to do about this, about next? Are you going to move his papers? What are you going to do? Here, the judge wants this. Some other people are filing a Freedom of Information Act to get that. Every decision sort of seemed, and we had a recession coming on. We had a lot of problems. I thought Ford did the right thing. It may not. I'm not sure he asked high enough price, but it was handled clumsily from a public standpoint. It wasn't. He didn't prepare the ground for it, so it came as a. Listen, I was working there. It came as an absolute shock. Came on a Sunday morning. I damn near drove the car off the road because it was like, whoa! I can't believe we just did that. And it had an air of a fix that had been a trade. That Ford had said, that Nixon said, if you pardon me, if you agree to pardon me, I'll go, and you'll be president. And I don't think there was a fix in. But it was I have zero belief in the fix, but I do think it was the right thing. We had to move on as a country. Did Nixon pay a sufficient price? Well, he was tormented the rest of his life.
Now move on to Reagan.
Sure.
What'd you do for him?
Well, that's like moving from the darkness to the sunshine, right, in some way. Reagan had such a sunny disposition. It was a surprise. Reagan was a surprise to me because I still suffered from that sort of Ivy League type education, and thinking here's this cowboy coming out of the West, and what the hell does he know? Washed up actor, and it turned out he knew more about leadership than he had more of it in his little finger than I had in my life, and I learned a lot about leadership from him. He had a sense if you unleashed the full energies and vision and dreams of the American people, there wasn't almost anything there was almost nothing we couldn't do together, but we had to do it together. And of course he did. He was more conservative than I was, but he knew that. He knew I was pro-choice, and before he asked me to join, and you don't always find that today. There's a lot of marginalization. If you don't believe 120% and 120% of everything, you're unacceptable in some Republican circles. But Reagan had a big tent, and he had a way of being. I'll tell you one quick anecdote, if you don't mind. We were early in the first year. He wanted to give a speech to the country about at prime time about the national budget deficits and what we had to do to get things under control, and he wanted to explain sort of what would happen to the deficits if we didn't get things under control, if the Congress didn't cut back some, and so he wanted to go on national television. Well, budget deficits are about as big a yawn as you can get in national politics. They are one of these, your eyes glaze over kind of problems. So I went to him and said, Mr. President, we need to do something to lighten up this speech. And at that time, we didn't have graphics or anything like that the way you do today. So I said, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put an easel behind your desk, sir, and have you, when you're in the middle of your speech, you'll be talking about the budget deficits. And I need you to keep reading from the teleprompter, get up and go over to this easel and take this red felt tip pen and draw a line showing what's going to happen to the budget deficits if we don't enact this program. And he said, okay, I'll be glad to do that. And I said, well, Mr. President, listen, you're a pro, I know, but this is in front of a national television audience. It's live. Would you mind coming over, sir, and rehearsing this before we do it? He said, no, I'll be glad to. So there was a 9 o'clock speech. And about 8:30, 20 minutes to 9, he came over, and we went into rehearsal. He got up and drew the line. It was all very flawless and vintage Reagan. And he sat back down, 9 o'clock, 70 million people tune in. And he got halfway in the speech, everything was going well, and then he got up to go over to the easel, and we'd made one mistake. We'd forgotten to put the cap back on that red felt tip pen, and there under those television lights, that thing had gone bony dry. And so he took and drew this, tried to draw this line. All you got was this little screech going across the easel with no line. Well, I'm in the Oval Office behind the cameras, about here in the first row, maybe second row, rewriting my resume, and I didn't know quite what to do, and I didn't have an answer. But fortunately, I had a guy who worked for me who was our TV guy, and he had had the foresight I didn't. He'd brought a second red felt tip pen, and this fellow named Mark Good, and he hit the floor in the Oval Office and started crawling across the Oval Office rug. And the Secret Service is looking at it. This is not in the playbook of Secret Service. Well, White House aide crawls at president, and Reagan's looking down. Here's this jackass crawling across my floor. And so here's the desk out here, and Mark crawls to the front of the desk, crawls around the desk, crawls up to Reagan's left pant leg, and holds up a second red felt tip pen. And Reagan got this little twinkle in his eye, and he reached down, did not miss a beat, reached down without anybody seeing it, and looked back in the camera and said, "I think I'll try my pen again." And he drew this beautiful line. And I was thinking to myself, if that had been Richard Nixon, first place, Richard was a very clumsy guy. He couldn't get his fingers around a dial telephone very well. You can imagine what he'd been like with an iPhone or something. But if it had been Richard Nixon, the speech would have been called off. We would have been thrown out on our tushes in the Rose Garden, and the bombers would have been over Cambodia in the morning. I'm just telling you, it would have been hell. But Reagan just took things in stride. I'd like to think it comes with age. I'd like to think some of us, as we've grown a little older, have mellowed out a little bit, maybe are a bit more reflective, but he was certainly that. Again, even though I didn't share some of his views, I look back with some pride. I think he was, in my judgment, as a leader, he was the best leader in the White House we'd had since FDR. And that's saying something, because that includes Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, both for whom I have enormous respect.
Now, you're very ecumenical.
Yeah.
And you turned your attention to a fellow by the name of Clinton, who what I understand is a D. How did that come to pass?
Bill Clinton, in some ways, he would not want to be compared to, and it's a little unfair to both of them, but he had some of Nixon's qualities. And that is, he was extremely bright in a different way. Maybe Hillary has a faster mind, and she's certainly she's extremely well-informed person. But Bill Clinton was able to process information faster than almost anybody I've ever seen. And he was just really, you'd be in a conversation with him sometimes in the Oval Office. I wasn't alone in this, and 3 or 4 people would be talking about something. And he would speak, he'd be very animated. And then while you were talking, he'd take out a New York Times crossword puzzle, and while I was listening to you, he'd be filling out the crossword puzzle. And you'd be saying something about some storm about to hit Florida, and he'd look up and say, "Who was that character in the second act of Aida?" And I found that sort of daunting. Actually, I found it insulting. But but he had that kind of brightness. At the same time, he had his struggles with character. We all know that. There was no secret about that. We have a saying down in North Carolina, where I'm from: "Hard dog to keep on the porch." We got his attention on that one. I
heard some barking back there.
But I actually thought Bill Clinton was a good president. And I must tell you, in comparison, he had a really tough situation in the Congress. There was a lot of hatred in that Congress for him, especially the Republicans. I remember, it's worth remembering, that he got impeached. I thought it was outrageous, but he did get impeached. But nonetheless, he still worked across the aisle, and he got welfare reform done. He got some other things. He got four balanced budgets in a row. And very importantly, social mobility increased under Clinton. The group that was growing the fastest in income for 2 or 3 or 4 years right in the middle of his presidency were the bottom quartile. We haven't seen that since. And that's an important factor in the way he conducted his presidency. He was a natural politician. I think he was a gifted politician, in many ways most gifted of his generation. I believe that he took a page from Jimmy Carter and has been a very good ex-president. I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding the foundation and everything, but I must tell you, I'm biased toward Clinton because I think he tried very hard to do a good job. And I think by and large he did a good job. And we haven't had that kind of sort of progress since on the domestic side in terms of working. Neither W nor President Obama, for all of President Obama's great strengths, has been able to work out with the Congress, the way Clinton did. And I give him credit for that.
Now, at the end of your book, you listed the 7 characteristics of a successful president ought to embody. And some of the people here, actually, I'm ashamed to say, haven't read all of your book.
I haven't either yet, but that's all right.
But maybe, why don't you just summarize what you thought those were?
Well, it's sort of like, we used to talk about this, about the news broadcast, and Andrea Mitchell doing it, showing you what working for the news broadcast, going on the air and saying, Moses came down from the mountains today with 10 commandments, and now for a look at the top 3. So let me just give you the top 3. I think it's, as I said before, I think character is fundamental to leadership. I don't care whether you're in the White House or you're running a church or a synagogue or running the local Rotary Club or running the Cleveland Clinic. People have to trust you. And, that's an issue we can talk more about, but I think trust is pretty fundamental to leadership. It's become more fundamental as the way leadership has changed over the years. It used to be, for much of human history, leadership was about being top down, ordering people at the point of a sword. You got to do this, or you got to do that, or you'll pay a price, right? And so ordering people, you get a set of results. Today, leadership is much more about influence, about persuasion, getting people to do things they may or may not want to do, nudging them, if you would. And that has a lot more to do with trust. If people have to trust you, you can't. A young man I spent a lot of time with, is now in Congress, was in Iraq, and talked about being a young officer there. And when he got pinned down by fire coming from a farmhouse, what he and his troops did, and they were behind a berm, and he asked them to go up and take the house, he knew they wouldn't go unless he went first. And he had to go up and he had to expose himself first. That was the only way he could lead. And so I think trust is pretty darn fundamental. The second thing is, and I think become ever more obvious in the last years, is judgment is expected of a leader. Because you have to make, the leader of any organization usually is the one who has to make the toughest calls. The easy calls are made by others. But in the presidency, the things that come to the president are the hardest. They're 51-49 kind of decisions. They're very, very close. And people say, well, you don't have to know that much. You can just hire really, really good advisors, and that will solve your problem. That only begins to solve the problem, because what happens in 51-49 type decisions is that your advisors are divided, and you're getting conflicting advice, and somebody has got to make the final call. And that goes back to the question of judgment. It was like one of the most famous examples in modern American history came with Harry Truman, and when he had to decide whether to recognize the state of Israel. And Clark Clifford and the domestic guys were all for recognizing him, but George Marshall, who was the most respected man in America and was Secretary of State, was against it, as was the State Department. They said, look, if we recognize there's going to be a war in that area, there's going to be disruption and the oil pipelines coming out of the Middle East, that's going to throw Europe into a deep recession, and communism will march across Europe. We can't do it, Mr. President. Should not do this. This was 1947. Truman had to make the call, and after they finished talking, he started talking to them about the Middle East. This is a man. Truman was the only president in the 20th century who never went to college. But he spent 7 years behind a mule on his family farm. His family was too poor to send him to college. But he was a self-educated man, and he read every book he could get his hands on. And once his advisors were divided and he had to sit there, he started telling them about the history of the Middle East. He gave them a 2-hour lecture, no notes, from memory, about the history of the Jews, what's happened in the Middle East. And he said, we're going to recognize. Now, it was a courageous decision, because if George Marshall, who objected, if George Marshall had resigned, Truman was going to lose the election in 48. But George Marshall stuck with him. Truman went on to win this come from behind victory, almost like the Cavaliers. It's that sense of judgment was really important to Truman. And I think you'll find that the best presidents have that, and it's an informed judgment. One of the differences between George W. and Reagan, both of them acted on their hunches, but Reagan had a much more informed sense of the world and America than W did. And I think as a result, George W. was a very fine man of high character in my judgment. I really respected how he dealt with his problems earlier in life. He had a walk on the wild side. Some would say a rather extended tour, but he was. But George W. had this. His hunches were not good hunches. They weren't solidly based. So I think that's the second. But third, you've really got to have a sense of vision of what you think the country ought to do, where it ought to be. You need to be. And there are other things building a team, getting started quickly, leaving behind a legacy. There are other things too, but I think those three are really important to the presidency.
Well, let's get a little more contemporary.
Sure.
I recently talked with Doris Kearns Goodwin.
That was a worthy conversation.
It was a fascinating conversation. And she made a comment about President Obama, saying that she really didn't think he liked the job of being president.
I agree.
Why?
I don't think, let me put it this way. I think he enjoys it a lot more now than he used to. There was a time when I worried that I thought he was going to go home at the end of one term. Because Barack Obama cares deeply about the issues. He cares deeply about social justice. This really talks about his comfort level with politics. And unlike Bill Clinton, who loved the arena and loved schmoozing, you couldn't get him off the phone at night. He'd be calling people at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. You want to know everything. Lyndon Johnson just loved the arena. Barack Obama is a much more much more introverted. He's probably one of the biggest introverts we've ever had there. And I think he enjoys the speaking. That part of it he loves, and he's obviously gifted at that.
Very.
And I think his speeches he gave as a candidate were among the best in the canon. But he doesn't, the backslapping is not who he is. And frankly, there's a sort of a disdain for legislators. And I think that's gotten in his way. What's worked for him recently is he's been doing a lot of things unilaterally. It's not that he's gotten Congress to go along. And I think that has its pluses because he's breaking through, let's say climate change, where we've been absolutely, paralyzed on the question of reasonable climate change positions. I think the president sort of picked it up and ran with it. But I think, we would have been so much better off if President Obama had been able to get a majority, a supermajority on the Affordable Care Act. It wouldn't have turned into the political football. When you have to give Obama credit. There were 7 presidents who tried it. He's the only person who got it through. So you got to give him a lot of credit for that. And I'd worked for 2 of them who tried. One was Nixon and another was Clinton. And we couldn't make it. And Obama got it through. But when I was there in the Clinton White House, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a mentor and a wonderful man, was then chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. And he used to call me and said, David, whatever you guys do on health care, make sure it passes by supermajority. All the major social initiatives of the 20th century that really stuck were ones that were passed with supermajority, starting with Social Security back in the 1930s, Medicare in the mid-60s, Civil Rights I in 64, Civil Rights II in 65. You can go through the list. He sent me bundles of historical material. And the point was, when you get a supermajority, that means people on both parties buy into it. And you get a substantial number of voters from the other side, in effect, who buy into it. And that then helps to conclude the political fight, the major political fight. You will still have fights over amendments, and later tweaking and so forth. But with Obamacare and with the Iranian agreement, there wasn't one single Republican that they ever got. And you can argue whether the damn Republicans were so recalcitrant. There's truth to that. It's also true that they weren't courted. and there wasn't much. They didn't feel much room was there. So I've always thought that we would be further along politically and have less uncertainty about the future of Affordable Care Act had it been passed by supermajority.
Let me change to something even more contemporary.
Okay. I don't know I can't imagine where you want to go. Yeah.
You've worked up close and personal with Hillary.
Yes.
And how does her characteristics fit your description of a successful president?
I think she has very good judgment. I think she's made mistakes, obviously, but by and large, I think the misjudgments she's really made are those that come close to home for her personally, as opposed to policy. I think she's had I went through just a hellacious time with her in the White House over the Whitewater documents, and it's a longer story. I'll spare you for now, but I thought I just disagreed with her judgment on that. Whereas I think her judgment on many of the policy issues are good. I thought her time in the Senate was well spent, and she got her head bit when she came to Washington. She come out of Arkansas. Both of them came out of Arkansas. It's not an easy leap to come from a small state to Washington. It's just really, really hard. Jimmy Carter was another example, and Clinton sort of struggled in the beginning, but he was such a good politician, he recovered. She came up with the idea that she was Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was communing with Eleanor in some ways. Doris got involved with that, and she had a very sort of inflated view of what could be done from the White House, and she got her head handed to her on the health care. And then I thought she moved more to the center and became, more realistic about politics. And I thought, as I say, in the time she was in the Senate, I thought she was first rate. She had her ups and downs as Secretary of State, but I thought that had more to do with the fact that the White House marginalized her to a significant degree as Secretary of State. Just as the George W. Bush administration had marginalized Colin Powell, they were such large figures that the White House felt a little threatened by having such a large major figure over there in that other institution. But still, I thought she was a very adequate Secretary of State. And this campaign has pulled her left. The Bernie Sanders threat has pulled her on trade, on Friday, on fracking. You can go through the list. But anyway, I think she has good judgment. I think she has a very good sense of the country's future. I think her issue is this trust issue in terms of governing. Right now, I think she's very likely to win this election. We can get to Trump, but she's very, very likely to win. But I do worry a lot about this question of whether the distrust factor. In my dealings with her, have not found reasons to distrust her. I have disagreed with her, but I haven't found that I didn't think she was lying to me or misleading me, or I didn't see other instances of that. So I've always been a little bit uncertain about why the feelings are so deep in the country, and 55, 60% of the people say they can't trust her. That's a real problem for governing, and it's a real problem in trying to persuade people to come along. So I think she's going to have to deal with this, and I think my view is that she needs to be as transparent as possible in everything henceforth. She needs to be straight about it with people. She needs to be transparent. She shouldn't be hiding the ball. This email stuff, she needed to be much more transparent on that. I think had she been transparent on emails, I think this thing might have gone away without all this investigation. We don't know where it's going to lead now. So I'm very concerned about that in terms of her presidency. I would like to see her, if she's elected, I think it's really important that she have a year or two to get some things done domestically before we get back into the mud again.
There's a rumor that she's running against another individual by the name of Trump. Yeah. And you've made a few comments publicly about him.
We don't know anything about that on cable news. We haven't paid any attention to it, isn't it? Donald Trump, I've tried to be open-minded about this.
Let me, first of all, did you predict this?
No.
Did you see it coming?
No. He didn't see it coming. A friend of mine told me, that she had talked to him shortly after he declared, and he said, this is going to last a few weeks. It'll be fun. I'll get my brand will strengthen. The Trump brand will be better, and that's the main source of his income. And then I'll get out and I'll endorse Chris Christie. And so I think this is all unfolded in a way that he hadn't expected. You have to give him credit for running, for a guy who never had any experience getting in the field against 16 other people and winning. You have to give him credit. He ran a very, very good primary campaign in terms of just the sheer winning of it. Let's not go to the atmospherics and the vitriol and all the rest of it. But he's running one of the worst general campaigns I've ever seen. He is in the process right now of his capacity to win this. I think 4 or 5 weeks ago, I thought he'd climbed up to maybe having a 35 to 40% chance of winning. I think it's gone down and down and down since then. I would say maybe today 20% chance. And if he's not careful, it's going to go below that. It's going to be a real blowout, which will have major consequences. Rob Portman, just ask Rob Portman. It's a very strange. There's a piece of me. You know psychology better than I do. There's a piece of me sometimes wonders: does he really want to be president? Has he gotten this close and he realizes this is not my kind of job? It's running a big organization, running the biggest organization in the world, and you got to have that calmness and you got to have the judgment. You know what this is like, and do you see those kind of qualities? I worry a lot about that. I used to think this was sort of an act, he was putting on, because I've met him in private. I took a class in to meet him. We spent an hour and a half with him. It was a group of Harvard students, and in New York, and he was charming, and the students really liked him. He was funny, yeah. He was totally obsessed with Donald Trump, but he's one of the most narcissistic people I think I've ever encountered. But the man you see on the stump is it was not the same guy you met in the office, and you kept on thinking, I've seen people put on acts before. Nixon used to put on an act, probably because he was another introvert. But I don't know. There was a part of me that wondered at times whether Al Gore really wanted to be president. You don't know from looking at it. But in the process, any event, the insults to women, you can't. If you look at the numbers today, he's unelectable. On the disapproval numbers, we've never seen, Hillary's numbers are high. We've never seen numbers as high as what Trump has for a nominee. 70% disapproval overall. 77% of women disapprove of him. Close to 90% of blacks disapprove of him. No, close to 90% of Hispanics disapprove of him. Over 90% of African Americans disapprove of him. That's unelectable territory. And you start out as a Republican down anyway. The demographics are such, they've changed so much. When Bill Clinton first ran for president, 88% of the electorate was Caucasian white. In this election, it's going to be about 68% of the electorate is Caucasian white. So the minority vote really matters now. And the conventional wisdom is for a Republican, you've got to get 40% of the Hispanic vote. Right now, he's got 90% disapproval from the Hispanic community. How's he going to get anywhere close to 40? Romney got 27. George W. proved it could be done. He got 44 when he ran for re-elect. But winning over that Hispanic vote is really important. And then you come down, you want this wall, you want these massive deportations. They're not going to happen. People are not going to be knocking on doors at night in this country and yanking people out of bed and putting them on buses and trains. It's just not going to happen. And it's sort of like, why would you keep talking about this? Let me go one more statistic, and then we'll go wherever you want to go. In terms of why it's difficult as a Republican. Over the last 6 elections, a majority of voters in 5 out of the last 6 elections have voted for the Democratic candidate. In those 6 elections, there are 18 states plus the District of Columbia that have voted for the Democratic candidate every single election. You need 270 electoral votes to win, right? Those 18 states plus D.C., as a Democrat, if you hold that blue wall, you start with 242. You're 28 short. Florida, it's over. And they're pouring money, and Democrats are pouring money into Florida, and she's got a lead there. So it's just it's hard to get elected in these situations, and he's this craziness. Going back to the leadership question, he just fired his campaign manager today. Well, that may or may not be a good thing, but the way you run your campaign is usually indicative of how you're going to run the White House. And if you've got chaos and tension and things are going awry in a campaign, that says something about what's going to be like if you're governing. So there's some tough issues here. I've tried to be as open-minded as possible about this. And I've tried to see, because I think and my views of Trump have turned considerably more negative, but it's important, I think, to go back to what we started, to separate out Trump from his voters. Not all the voters are like Donald Trump. And not all the voters are yahoos. And we need to understand why people are voting for him rather than condemning them for voting for him. It's very much more important for the country if we can get a hold of these populist forces and try to address them in a constructive way, respectful way, and to listen and to see, because otherwise we're never going to heal the divisions we have among us.
Well, I got one more question, and then we're going to take some questions for the audience. So,
Sure.
So we're very excited to have the convention here in Cleveland. And Cleveland has shined itself and has really done a tremendous job getting ready.
Yeah.
How do you see this convention shaking out for this community?
It could be historic. You could have history made here twice in 1 year. I don't think we know. It's not going to be a lullaby. If this downward spiral continues, there's going to be a real panic in the Republican Party about, there's so much at play here. I mean, all three branches of government are at play in this election: the Supreme Court, the House and the Senate, plus the White House. And the general feeling is that, this is the conventional wisdom, and I think it has some merit here, is whoever wins by 5% or more, they will take the Senate with them. In other words, if Hillary win by 5%, it's a tough go for Rob Portman. It's in terms of the turnout and what he has to face up to. That's not to say he can't win it, it's just the odds shift. And then the conventional wisdom is, in order to win the House, Hillary would have to win by 10 or more. Well, right now, she's probably, the average of the polls, she's 6-7 ahead, but I'm telling you, the trend line here is really very tough for Trump. Not to say he can't get there. So it's a tough hill to climb, and I think in terms of the convention, there's going to be an extraordinary. This is the first time in my lifetime when the meeting of the Rules Committee of a convention may be on primetime television. I mean, it's usually a nothing ball. And we're going to be watching every minute of it because, I mean, if there is this revolt, there is going to be a potential revolt to try to overturn the rules and try to open this up. And, that would come with a huge price. You got 15 million votes. And we've just never been through anything like this before. I assume he'll get the nomination, and I assume he'll march out of here with some sense of progress, but you don't know. He goes off teleprompter in an acceptance speech, and we could go anywhere. He won't know himself.
Speaking of going anywhere, we're going to go over here for the first question.
Yeah. You've had a long career in journalism and politics.
Yeah. Well,
who's been the person that you've interviewed who's been your favorite to interview versus the most impressive? And are they different?
You mean who did the best job of interviewing?
Well, the person who you felt like you really connected with versus the person that you sat with and you thought...
You mean the anchor?
Well, yes, probably in that case, because you've done some interviews, but I mean, someone
I've done some interviews myself with other people.
No. Who do you think has been the most impressive or your favorite?
Well, take me out of it.
Well, your heart's they got there, right up there, you know. It's actually a fellow named David Rubenstein right now. I don't know if you know David. He's become one heck of an interviewer. He's with the Carlyle Group, and he runs a private equity firm, highly successful. And he turns out he's a wonderful interviewer. But listen, in journalism, I go back to some of the people. I'm much more of a traditionalist because I think some of the people I knew in the past, I knew Walter Cronkite reasonably well, and I thought he was a terrific interviewer in the sense of he didn't press his audience, the people so hard, but he brought things out which were really good. I thought Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil, particularly Jim Lehrer, Ted Koppel was first class. And on international issues, Peter Jennings was, because he lived abroad, he paid his dues. Most of the people who are on television don't know anything about what it's like to be living abroad. I mean, a story came up about Beirut. Peter knew the streets in Beirut. And could tell you what was happening in that sense. And we don't have enough journalists like that. Tom Friedman's been trained like that, but not very many journalists have been trained like that. And Tom Brokaw. Tom Brokaw is one of the most interesting. If you haven't had him out here for the series, I'd recommend him. You've had him. He's a wonderful man, and he's dealing with some serious health issues. But he just brings something out. But I go back to Koppel on Nightline, and of course Tim Russert was sort of in a class by himself, and we miss him. We miss him in this circus this year. But I've had a chance to interview people, and Doris Kearns Goodwin was, I think, one of the best storytellers. I love storytellers. I love David McCullough, I love Doris Kearns Goodwin, and I love Stephen Ambrose. And I had a chance for McNeil Lehrer to interview Ambrose a few times about his books, and they were always wonderful. And when he was dying, McNeil Lehrer let me go down with the camera to interview him. We all knew he was dying. He knew he was dying. I spent a day with him, and I came away with the conclusion, as hard as it is, some of the best conversations I've ever had in life were with people who were near death and were about ready to go out, and they face reality in a different way. And I've just had some of the most moving experiences of my life going to visit people in their last stages. And it's like they just leave indelible impressions on you. And that day I spent with Ambrose was one of the most memorable days of my last 20 years or so.
Thank you.
Much of candidate Trump's personal platform seems on the face of it to be antithetical to core American values, and certainly the values embodied in this institution in which we're all sitting. My question to you is that, having emphasized character as a core requisite of American leadership, putting Mr. Trump aside, what does it say about character that so much of the leadership of the Republican Party is willing to endorse a candidate whose positions are as I've described?
Well, I wouldn't paint with such a broad brush as you have. There are about 60 major figures in the Republican Party who have not endorsed. That's the largest number we've ever seen, to my knowledge. But I think you have to be sort of fair to the people about who are trying to draw this distinction between supporting and endorsing. It's a distinction without a difference to most of us, but listen, they're in very conflicted situations, and you can. One of the first rules of politics is survival, and if you're in a district or a state where Trump is going to win, and you essentially come out against him, you can write your own obituary. Now, is that and I think party loyalty is not such a bad thing. Would I wish for something better? Yeah, I would. Had a better outcome. Yes, and I think that I hope Republicans have learned that the Democrats, there's something that's right about the Democrats having these superdelegates. I happen to think peer review is an important way to conduct business generally. You don't want to put somebody at the head of the Cleveland Clinic who hasn't had peer review. You need, and so the superdelegates give you that. There was something about the smoke-filled room, yes, it didn't give everybody a voice, but we got some pretty darn good people out of the smoke-filled room. With, most of our major presidents, and most successful presidents, came out of a smoke-filled room. So I think the combination of having the voters have a large voice, but having some votes reserved for people who actually know the candidates and are sort of long-term stewards of the party. These parties are not just sort of play toys. They're important institutions. And people who are sort of the trustees of the future of the party ought to have a voice about who the nominee is. And I think had the Republicans had superdelegates the way the Democrats had, I'm not sure Trump would have been the nominee. I think it's a very good chance it would have been either John Kasich or Jeb Bush or someone who was more of a mainstream type candidate who was then trusted. And I think that's important. And Bernie Sanders has been railing against the superdelegates on the Democratic side, but I actually think they provide ballast, if you would, about the selection of people.
Hello, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And I would like to know if you think the internet will replace network news.
No, I don't. It's a good question. I remember not so long ago we used to have arguments when television was going to replace movies, right? And now what's happened on television? Movies are flourishing, and series are flourishing on television. The kind of things we used to see in movie theaters. So I think what you're going to see is some sort of a combination of things, and what you're going to find is that a lot of the highlights of television news you can find on podcasts, or you're going to find on your iPad very, very quickly. You'll have an app for whatever you want to watch out of the news. And so there'll still be news broadcasts. What I do think we're heading toward, and what worries me a lot, is we are becoming much more, at a time when American leadership is in question around the world, we're becoming much more insular in our news reporting. And we're not paying attention to what's going on in the world. One of the things you ought to be proudest about with the Cleveland Clinic is the way it's becoming a global institution. I had the opportunity to visit the Abu Dhabi Center before it opened, the Cleveland Clinic, and it's marvelous that the clinic is moving out, but at the same time, a lot of our attention as citizens is moving inward. We're becoming more insular than we should. We don't even recognize what's going on in Canada with the new Trudeau government. We get so down on our own government. Look at the freshness that Trudeau is bringing to Canada. And he's a feminist at heart. He's dashing. He's interesting. He's not perfect by any means, but he's bringing new life and new hope to Canada. That's right on our doorstep, and we're not paying any attention to it. And it would help us think about American politics if we did that. So that's my real beef right now is, besides the fact that we got, I think there's a substantial question whether we've been enablers in the Trump campaign. That's a debatable proposition, but one worth debating. But no, I think the internet is not going to replace everything else. And the only other issue I'd raise is there's so much sewage on the internet that there ought to be a way we could have more civil conversations. I mean, the polarization we're seeing in our politics, you can see in spades on the internet.
Two more questions, one over here.
What's your take on whether or not President Obama is going to be able to appoint a Supreme Court nominee before he leaves office?
Well, I think the Republicans are going to make a real mistake if Hillary wins the election and they don't confirm Garland. I mean, John Garland, in and of himself, is a very qualified person. And from the Republican standpoint, he comes about as close to being from the center as anybody they're ever going to find. So I've been surprised they haven't gone ahead and held hearings on him and moved the confirmation process to the point that after the elections, if Hillary were to win, then you could go ahead and confirm. Right now, they seem to be stuck. I don't know quite what their theory is. I don't know what their theory is. It's a good question. But listen, there's a very reasonable chance 3 members of the court are going to move into their 80s during the first term of the next president. So, and you've already got the Scalia opening. So there may be at least 3 or 4. And now we've heard, there are rumors now that Clarence Thomas is thinking of stepping down. So there may be several openings, and it could be that one of the most important roles the next president may well play is determining the shape and future of the court for the next 20 to 30 years.
Okay, over here.
Thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about Mr. Trump firing his campaign manager. I wanted to know if you think this signals some sort of big shift for him, maybe away from this sort of let Trump be Trump strategy that they've had, or is it maybe more looking for somebody with more of a financial plan for him to up his fundraising?
That's a very sophisticated question. The campaign manager he fired today has, one of his responsibilities has been fundraising, which is going pretty terribly. And could be yet another piece of the undoing of the Trump candidacy. It's very, very unclear. You know, this may be the 5th, 7th, 10th time when we've heard, well, he's doing this. Does that mean he's going to change? And every time it doesn't mean he's going to change. So we'll have to wait and see. I don't know. One of the problems, and one of the reasons that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders have been sort of hesitant, you know, is that they've had conversations with people around the candidate. The candidate himself says in private gatherings, I get it, I have to do this and I have to do that, I know I have to be more presidential. And then they talk to a Manafort, or they talk to the fired campaign manager, and they say, oh, he's going to change, he's going to change. And then he goes out and gives this yet another Trumpian Trump speech. And the credibility isn't there yet. And it's not going to come with the firing of one person. It's going to come from what he does now I think he's got from now until the Cleveland Convention to convince people that in fact he's going to be presidential. And you haven't seen that side of him as much yet. And he'll live up to that job. If he does not do that, by the time of the Cleveland Convention, it's going to be a much more contentious convention. And I just think that's what we're going to be going through. But I want to, and so it's a very good question, but I don't want to leave on the notion that all is gone, you know, our future as Americans is dark. I do think we're coming into some more rough years. You know, there are increasing signs now that the economy is going to slow down yet again. There are increasing signs we may actually have yet another recession, not as deep, but in the next 18 months to 2 years. The next president, let's say if it's Hillary, I hope we'll get at least 1 year. I hope 2 years would be better to govern, but you can't be sure about that because of this distrust factor and because this may be a very poisonous campaign. And so there are a lot of things, the reasons to believe that the next couple of years could be rough. But I think if you look into the longer term future, that it's much brighter for the country, and that we ought to take hope in that and not be despairing. I mean, Dr. Cosgrove can speak with far more eloquence than I can about, you know, the breakthroughs that are coming in the life sciences and how much American research and American bench science is going to make a difference in the world and the longevity and the quality of life. But you look at the energy field where American ingenuity has made a huge difference already. Look what's coming in digital technologies. You go in 3D printing. You can go through the industries of the future, and in every case you'll find that America is at the forefront, and innovation is in our DNA. You've seen it here in your own lives here with the clinic. You know, how much this thing has mushroomed through good strong leadership, but there's a lot of innovation that goes into that. So I think that we remain, for whatever reason, we remain the most innovative big country in the world. There are small countries, Switzerland, Israel, are small countries which are doing really interesting things. But America's got the most innovative, we still have the most innovative country in the world if we keep at the research and keep the investment up in human resources. But the other thing that's going on is that we have a generation that's coming, of young people who are coming, who, in the millennial generation, just a little older, a lot of them are couch potatoes. A lot of them feel entitled. But I'm telling you, there are an extraordinarily large number of young people coming through the system coming up today who are the most interesting, exciting, patriotic, innovative young people I've seen in a long time. They remind me very much of the World War II generation. They deeply care about the country. I see them as social innovators. They're social entrepreneurs are in the field. And frankly, we've got a lot of these young men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, taking off their uniforms or stepping up to it. I'll just tell you one quick story and close on this, because it's someone I've come to believe in very much. A young man I met when he was a senior at Harvard in 2001. He did not come from money. Dad works on a public golf course, but he was there on scholarship. And he gave the class day speech there and asked, what is the call to greatness for our generation? What's called to greatness for our generation? And he didn't know, he wasn't sure himself, but issued the call. And he decided that summer that he ought to give back, he ought to issue his own call, and he signed up to the United States Marine Corps as an infantry officer. That's very rare at Harvard. Went to Quantico. And then we had 9/11. And he was in on the first wave, went into Iraq, came back with his troops to Pendleton, went back for a second tour, went back for a third tour. Petraeus had noticed him at this point, Harvard grad, really interesting, bright physics major. And then his name is Seth Moulton, and Seth had finished 3 tours, hung up his uniform, started to go to the Harvard Business School and the Kennedy School as a joint degree student. And David Petraeus, General Petraeus, called him and said, I've just been named commander of all the forces in Iraq. I need your help. Would you come back? Would you put your uniform back on? And he did. And he went back for a 4th tour, very dangerous. But fortunately, and he had a lot of questions about the war. Fortunately, he made it through. Turned down Goldman Sachs. He came back, went to Harvard. He's got 3 degrees from Harvard, 4 tours in Iraq. Turned down Goldman Sachs, went to do a startup in Texas. Got a call from his buddy saying, hey, there's a congressman up in your district in northern Massachusetts on the North Shore who's got ethical problems. He's Democrat. Why don't you come up and challenge him? And Seth, you don't do that in Massachusetts. You do not run against the establishment. Every Democrat opposed him when he went back. Said, you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't. We'll have to live it through with this other guy. And he took it, after 6 months, he took his first poll. He was 50 points down after 6 months of campaigning. And his campaign manager said, you need to quit. You're not going to make it. Give the money back. So he fired his campaign manager and put his driver, who'd served with him in Iraq, put his driver in charge of his campaign, went on to win the primary, and won the general election. He's now a freshman member of Congress. His name is Seth Moulton. And he just was on the front page of the Daily News, coming out with a strong piece about banning assault weapons. But the most interesting part of the story was that a week before the election, well, 2 parts. One is he's working like crazy in Congress now to build a bipartisan coalition. He's taking Republican members of Congress out to dinner. They're working together. They're trying to create new politics. We're trying to get more people like this elected. But the other part of the interesting story was a week before the final election, the Boston Globe, one of their spotlight reporters, had a piece on the front page of the Globe saying, we've been trying for months to get Mr. Moulton's military records to see if he's been lying about his service in Iraq. And he won't give them to us. And we still can't get them. But we did finally found a source. And it's true. He has not told us the full truth about his military service. And that is, that while he was there, he got 2 medals for heroism. One was a Bronze Star. This man owns a Bronze Star. 2 medals for heroism. He never told the voters. And I called Seth and said, Seth, why didn't you say anything? It turned out he never told his parents. And I said, why? He said, I'm a Marine and we don't brag. And the other thing is, my enlisted guys deserved it as much as I did. And I didn't feel good talking about it. That's the next generation. He's not alone. There are a lot of Seth Moultons coming up. So we ought to take heart. Let's not get too discouraged by the craziness of the circus that's coming to your town. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
David, I can't thank you enough. It's been a tremendous pleasure, and I know I speak on behalf of all of us for you enlightening us on your insights into former presidents and your ongoing commentary on the contemporary scene. And I want to remind all of you that we're going to take a summer recess. We're coming back in the fall, and Fred Smith, who is the CEO and the started up a company called Federal Express, is going to be here. And then in December, Angela Duckworth is going to be here, the recent author of the book called Grit. And I think you're going to enjoy both of them. So
great speakers, both great speakers. Congratulations, you've been a great speaker.
And David, thank you again.
Thank you very, very much.